But how do you got to develop a real skill
Hi,
level where not to get killed by the base?
I am at this panel, I think, in a slightly different context, which is most of the other presenters have been talking about the ways in which online media can actually affect real-world politics, as it were, or ways in which they're representations of real-world politics. I thought my remit was to talk about the ways in which political scientists or scholars themselves can use social media and other sort of forms of online publications as a way to enhance their own publication profiles and other sorts of ways of doing it. I also took Christian's remit to not use that many words very seriously. Both of these things have taught me just not to take Christian nearly as seriously as I normally should. But we'll go from there. So the biggest question I think to ask is, why should you do any of this stuff? It's funny that Christopher talked about email. Email is one of those things that we now have to accept as given, as a part of a job that we as scholars must do. You can't be a professor without having an email account. That's just simply inconceivable. But you can be a professor or a scholar without being on Twitter or Facebook or having a blog or any one of these kinds of things. And let me stress, going forward, I fear a world where everyone would be required to have all of these things. So I don't want these things to be mandatory in any way whatsoever, or to be so overwhelming that sort of social network externalities will cause people to have them. But that said, let me make the relative case for why you should do this or why not. So the obvious reason is that what do we all care about if you're a professor, which is you need to publish. That is still a general rule. And there are two gatekeepers for a successful publication. The first gatekeeper is whether or not there is an editor. You've got to get it past someone who actually thinks, in the form of peer reviewers or what have you, that what you are publishing is actually worth it. And that is very difficult. We all know the difficulties occasionally in publishing peer-reviewed scholarship. That said, the second thing is assume you get past that. The other problem is, what is the public reception or the scholarly reception in terms of what you do? How are they going to take what you read as being relatively important or not? And while these people look relatively anodyne, there are other people that are super mean when they read stuff and disagree with you potentially. So, there are general risks potentially in terms of publishing, particularly if you're publishing within traditional scholarly outlets where in fact the clear hierarchy of prestige is such that sort of preeminent scholars have a dramatic and oversized effect on the perception of you in the field. Now that said, there's a whole welter now of new forms of ways of publishing, whether it be online outlets or podcasts or various other sort of forms of social media, and of course the monkey cage, which is now no longer really a blog, but I would argue the APSR of op-eds, in that what it is morphed into now, this is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is a thing in which if you publish within that, you actually get scholarly credibility for it, because it's seen as something that is legitimate, because the monkey cage actually edits it. And I think a lot of blogs that 10 years ago were thought of as sort of straightforward blogs are now, interestingly enough, sort of edited, curated forms of op-eds. That's neither better nor worse than it was, it's just different. But I do think what it has done is expanded the possibility or the number of outlets that people can publish on as a way of getting wider readership beyond scholarship. And so I think that in and of itself is potentially worthwhile. Related to this is that you are now operating in a world in which there are multiple sort of online venues that are genuinely interested in social science. Whether it's 538 or Vox or the New York Times Upshot or Foreign Policy, these are people that either are reporters that are actually willing to talk to people about the ways in which social science work, or potentially would solicit contributions from you and others to actually publish with these things. And these sorts of publications do give an imprimatur to political scientists, economists, other social scientists, people interested in international relations. So the question is, why should you do this? Beyond the obvious thing of presumably by doing these kinds of things, you are surpassing the original barrier to publication, which is the peer review process, and potentially just actually trying to access and publish something that people would actually read. Well, the first obvious advantage to this is that basically social media acts and blogs and all of these things act as a massive amplifier for whatever your scholarly work is. So presumably, if you have a scholarly project, you think you have generated interesting results, the interesting results actually have real-world implications, you presumably want people other than scholars to know about all of this stuff. And I guarantee you, other people will not be accessing International Organization or ISQ or the Journal of Obscure Studies. What they are going to do is access other forms of media in which they can potentially get some distillation of what your argument is. And so therefore there is a virtue in using these kinds of media actually to advertise your scholarly wares. The second thing you will get is feedback, and feedback in a more instantaneous way than you could possibly imagine than if you publish a peer-reviewed scholarly publication. And that is also potentially worthwhile. The other thing you will do is potentially engage in networking. And here I mean networking beyond your narrow social science discipline or beyond your narrow subfield. There are other people in the world who are, scholars in different disciplines or experts in think tanks or other forms of intellectuals that are genuinely interested in what you do that you would not meet otherwise if it wasn't for the fact that they follow you on Twitter or they like something that you're posting on Facebook or they listen to your podcast or what have you. And this expands your universe, which I think is intellectually a healthy thing. I would also argue, however, that in some ways, a lot of the way that people talk about social media or blogs or what have you is as a marketing device. In other words, you come up with an initial scholarly idea, you do the rigorous work, and then you use all of this stuff to market it. But I would also argue that the causality works in reverse, too. That there are ways in which sometimes if you engage in social media or you opine about something that you might not necessarily have done a lot of work about, but is more speculative, you can wind up by consuming this stuff as well, generating interesting research questions that you can then go back, do the scholarly work on, and then be able to make an additional contribution. I can think of at least 3 different projects that I've published in peer-reviewed outlets that had their origins in terms of debates that I engaged in online to a question that I hadn't thought about, or a question that I thought was so intuitively obvious that I then realized no one had actually written an answer to it. And another utility of this is that it actually helps you learn to speak in a language other than scholarship. And by that I mean other than jargon. Which is, if you want to actually try to publish in online media, you have to be able to write in a language that ordinary people can read. And let's face it, we've all been trained within an inch of our lives of not writing like that. And I think there is a virtue in writing cleanly and writing clearly. I think one of the biases that we have sometimes in scholarship is that if it's something that's somehow accessible to ordinary readers, it must not be that complex or that smart. And I think that's a horseshit story. And I think, therefore, it needs to be realized that, in fact, writing cleanly and clearly and crisply is actually a virtue rather than a disadvantage. And hopefully, if you're really, really lucky, you will develop your own quality, classy brand, that people will potentially associate with. Okay, and one final systemic effect of this, which is I think that more political scientists that do this, it actually helps to combat the perception among some, particularly in the policymaking community, that we are somehow a junior discipline that must be deferential to economists. And here I'm thinking about when Paul Krugman sort of slammed Kate McNamara over the summer because Kate dared to make an argument that things like identity might actually matter in terms of the Eurozone, which I think is actually an extremely valid argument, and yet one that is, Krugman was completely blinkered to. So that's fine. What are the downsides? And there are several, let me be clear about that. The first is, and I think this is the more exaggerated one, is a fear that by doing all of this, somehow you will receive opprobrium within your department or within your scholarly community. And I certainly think that if we were doing this presentation 10 years ago, I would be warning everyone about this. But I do think the world has changed in this sense, in that I think it's possible to still be able to do this stuff, and so long as you continue to generate a decent amount of scholarly output, that won't hurt you. In a way that I think 10 or 15 years ago was not necessarily the case. So this is an exaggerated fear. That said, there is something called envy, and this matters because the hierarchy of prestige in these online worlds are very different from the hierarchy of prestige in the scholarly world. And it is possible that someone who might be seen as scholarly prestigious decides to enter this world and discover they don't have nearly as big of a voice as they thought, and suddenly they're dealing with, God forbid, graduate students or undergraduates or people without any scholarly training whatsoever actually weighing in on the things that they say, and they don't like dealing with this. And so as a result, there will be some degree of envy for people if they survive and thrive in this world, relative to normal traditional scholars that don't know what to make of this and therefore fear it. Another problem is what I would refer to as the telephone game, which is one of the aspects of these kinds of online publications is that presumably you are distilling what your argument is, which means you're eliminating all the hedges, all the qualifications. You are essentially making a caricature version of whatever your scholarly argument is. And shockingly enough, people will then misinterpret that caricature, and then furthermore, people won't even read that caricature. They'll read the single tweet describing the caricature, or they'll see the headline describing the caricature, at which point your argument now loses any semblance of what it originally was. But you are therefore tagged with it, and you have to cope with that. So one of the problems, and I say this from personal experience, is when you make an argument that then winds up getting twisted beyond whatever your original purpose was, and you have to constantly play defense in order to be able to explain what your original argument actually was. And then there are trolls. Which is to say, if you engage in a large public audience, you know, there is an online community, a very large one, that does not like anything successful whatsoever. That essentially the entire online world of trolls basically resembles the burn book in Mean Girls. And so as a result, people will not like, you know, it doesn't matter really in some ways the content of your argument. The very fact that you are making an argument publicly and successfully will breed resentment. And not just resentment, really, really angry resentment. All right? And God forbid, I'm relatively lucky, I've had to experience some of this. I'm a white guy with mainstream American foreign policy views. If you don't meet any of those criteria, if you were a woman, if you were a minority, if you hold relatively radical views, trust me, the trolls will be far, far worse. And so this is something you just have to learn to develop with, or ignore, or simply, as they put it, don't read the comments. That said, let me offer one last cautionary warning again. Not everyone has to do this. I think it's an opportunity, but I certainly don't think it would be required. And I think some people, I can think of many colleagues that I do not want to see on Twitter, or do not want to see posting blogs. It would not be good for them, and it would not be good for political science, frankly. So, you know, it's just as well. That said, if you are going to do this, let me offer two final closing suggestions, which is one of the things that you should probably try to do if you really want to weigh in to public debates is not just talk about your own scholarship, but also talk about the ways in which the public consensus about a particular issue is at odds with whatever the political science or scholarly consensus is about a particular issue. And that's actually relatively important. I think those are the areas, presumably, where we as scholars can potentially make a great difference. Not just your own initial research, but rather there's an idea that is so accepted as given that it doesn't even occur to us that we need to make this argument publicly, except it turns out that we actually do. And then one final thing I would point out, I'm writing a book right now on actually the marketplace of foreign policy ideas in the United States, and I would argue there are two kinds of intellectuals that try to engage the wider audience. There are public intellectuals, and then there are thought leaders. Both of these terms are not terribly fun. Public intellectuals are basically Isaiah Berlin's foxes. They know a little bit about a lot and can usually be very good critics and tell you why someone who comes up with an idea is really wrong. They're not that much fun. Thought leaders are evangelists. Thought leaders have one big idea that they think can explain everything in the world. And I would argue that one of the problems we might have as a discipline is that thought leaders are paid far more attention to than public intellectuals. So if you decide to actually enter the wider world through online media, I strongly encourage you to do so in some ways as public intellectuals a little more than as thought leaders. Because in some ways I think the best thing that we can do as scholars is engage in the act of criticism, not just the act of idea generation. Thank you very much.